basically what I'm interested in is gambling over time where we have some uncertainty involved. And I'll get into exactly what that means. But I'll just start off with a simple example where we have a horse race. We have 5 different horses. And maybe we have some belief about which of these horses is going to win the race. So we have some probability distribution over the winning horse. And we're interested in gambling settings, so we have some odds maker that is going to return a multiplier if we bet money on any of these horses winning. So for instance, if we bet that horse 5 is going to win the race, then we'll double our money if that turns out to be true. And I'll be mostly looking at settings where we're going to assume that the odds maker is fair. And what that means is that the odds maker doesn't take an extra cut of whatever you wager just for providing these odds. So in other words, if you were to take the inverse of each of these odds and add them together, they add to 1. So really the odds maker has an equivalent belief about what the outcome of the race will be. And if those beliefs differ, then there's an opportunity to make some money. So kind of the classical way to think about this is to consider the expected payoff. And that's just obtained by multiplying these two numbers together. In this case, for horse 2, we have a positive, or we have a expected payoff beyond what we wager. So for every dollar we wager in expectation, we expect to get $1.20 back. So that seems like a really great thing. So if you really just wanted to naively maximize your expected payoff, you put every dollar you own on horse 2 winning the race. But the problem with that is there's really only a 20% probability that you'll have any gain at all. There's an 80% probability that you'll end up losing all your money. And that's, for most of us, not something that we want to have happen. So in other words, if you were to employ this sort of strategy, you'd end up bankrupt with high probability over time. So John Kelly looked at this problem, and he said, okay, instead of maximizing our expected payoffs, we should instead maximize the expected growth rate of our investment. And what that implies is that we should just allocate our current resources in proportion to our belief about the outcome of the horse race. So in this case, we would put 50% of our money as a bet on horse 5 winning the race, 20% on horse 2, and so on. And this seems like maybe too simple of an idea, but it turns out that it's been very successful in practice. And particularly, there's extensions that Kelly came up with to settings with unfair odds that I'm not really going to go into. But Kelly was a colleague of Shannon at Bell, and Shannon and Ed Thorpe actually took these ideas to Vegas, where they came up with blackjack card counting schemes and were able to make a lot of money there. And then they took the same ideas to the stock market and were able to make a lot of money there as well. And it's also reported that Warren Buffett uses these sorts of criteria to make his investment decisions. So despite the simplicity of this underlying objective, it turns out to work very well in practice. But what Kelly found, and I think is even more interesting, is the connection to information theory. So here you can imagine that before each of the horse races, you're given some information. And this information is going to tell you something about what the outcome of the horse race will be, but it doesn't tell you exactly. It gives you a new distribution to believe in. So given this information, you should allocate your investments according to the conditional probability of the winning horse, given that information. And what Kelly was able to show is that the value in terms of the increase in your expected growth rate of investment is exactly the mutual information between that side information that you're being provided and the horse race outcome. But really, in a lot of settings, there could be additional dependence. So here we're just considering independent horse races that continue over time. But in a lot of settings where we might want to make investments, there's more dependence involved. So maybe the outcome of this race will help influence the outcome of the next horse race. And similarly, maybe the past information that we've received and the past outcome of some particular event will determine the side information that we receive in the future. And once you have this additional structure, you can no longer just use this simple mutual information relationship. And the reason is because if you know, for instance, some future side information, that tells you about the past, and in practice you wouldn't have actually known that side information until you actually got to that stage in the sequence of gambles. So a recent extension looked at this in more detail and found that he valued the side information in this causal setting where you receive this information over time and there's some structural dependence is related to the directed information. And the directed information is based on the causally conditioned probability. So this is like a conditional probability, except that each of the x variables is conditioned only on the y variables up until that point in time. So x2 is conditioned only on y1 and y2 and not on y3. So that's the key difference there. The second extension that's been looked at recently is how to deal with the fact that in reality you don't really know the true distribution of horse race outcomes. So you have some uncertainty. In this setting, the expected growth rate is going to depend on the KL divergence between the odds makers distribution, which is right here, and the distribution of your bet allocation. Right? And you need your bet to be closer to reality under the scale divergence metric than the odds makers. And if it is, then you have expected positive growth for your investment. So what people who actually employ the Kelly criteria for stock investments and other investment opportunities do is they kind of take into account that they have some model uncertainty in whatever model they've come up with to formulate this original belief, and they kind of moderate their belief in some way to move it closer to whatever odds are available in the market. But this seems like a pretty ad hoc thing to do. They're just kind of arbitrarily cutting this distance in half and using a belief there. So instead, what Grunwald showed or argued is that we can take a much more sophisticated approach to model this uncertainty. So for instance, maybe we have knowledge that the true distribution lies in this convex region here, and we can then come up with a bet allocation that makes use of this information. And a really natural thing to do, I think, is to make sure that we're maximizing the worst case growth of our investments given this sort of constraint. And one way that you can look at this is that we're first choosing a bet allocation, so some point in this simplex, and then nature or some adversarial opponent is choosing the actual outcome of horse races, for instance, that has to satisfy this constraint, so be within this region. There's a nice minimax duality argument here where we can just flip the order of these two operations. And once we've done that, now nature is first choosing the true distribution, and then we're coming up with a bet allocation based on that. But we've already seen from Kelly's work that once we know the true distribution, we know exactly what bet allocation to take. And that's to set our betting allocation to be equivalent to that true distribution. So this really just reduces down to minimizing a KL divergence between our betting allocation and the odds makers' belief in the outcome of horse races. And that corresponds to choosing the belief point here that's closest to the odds makers' odds. So just to maybe make this a little more concrete, maybe your friend has seen these horses race thousands of times before, and he tells you, in expectation, the winning horse's number is going to be 4.0. And the problem is there's a lot of different ways to satisfy that, right? Horse 4 could always win the race. horses 3 and 5 could each win the race 50% of the time. But if you bet according to one of these, when the other one is true, you end up losing all your money, which isn't a good thing. So if we look at the KL divergence, so this actually we'll look under uniform odds, and in this case, this is really just the entropy of these distributions. And both of these have relatively low entropy. But if we instead maximize the entropy or the KL divergence under uniform odds, then we end up with a distribution that has much higher entropy and nicer guarantees in terms of how well we'll do in terms of betting. So the contribution of my work is to combine these two ideas. So we're going to look at settings where we have sequences of side information being provided, and we also have uncertainty about the true outcomes of different events. And there's going to be structural dependence between these two things. And what I'm going to do is tie this to a lot of research that I've done on decision prediction. So I'll start by looking at optimal control settings, and then look at behavior prediction, and finally how behavior prediction can be extended to the sequential investment setting that I'm interested in this talk. So normally if you think about sequential behavior settings, you have some initial state that you find yourself in, and you can take an initial action, and that initial action will then transfer you to some new state based on what your current state is. And you repeat this process. And what we're going to assume is that we have some known dynamics for how the world works. So we have some distribution that we know that the next state will be drawn from given our current state in action. We know that, and this agent knows that as well. But what we don't know is the policy of the agent. We don't know what action the agent will take when he encounters a particular state. And the decision theoretic view of this problem is that you can take some assumption about what rewards the agent is trying to optimize. So basically, for any state-action combination, you have some real-valued utility that the agent receives, and then you can find the optimal policy that maximizes the expected cumulative reward over time. But we're interested in prediction instead of prescribing this behavior. So instead, we're going to have sequences of observed states and actions, and we're going to use those to construct this unknown probability distribution for the agent's policy. So if we get rid of everything that we know about, we can reduce this to a very familiar statistical estimation task, and that's how do we estimate a distribution? And what we're going to do is employ some basic principles using information theory and maximum causal entropy. And really this work is motivated by recent successes in computer science that have used conditional random fields for a lot of different tasks. And this is just an example, but here we have some raw pixels, and we're trying to make a prediction about what letters those pixels correspond to. And the way that this is accomplished is statistics are taken that relate the raw pixels to the actual characters that correspond, and similarly statistics between consecutive characters. And we've come up with some distribution that matches these statistics of empirical data that we've gathered with the distribution we're coming up with. And the way that this is accomplished in conditional random fields, even though they don't view it this way, is that they're maximizing this conditional entropy measure. And this gives a familiar exponential family distribution where the Lagrange multipliers end up being weights on these different types of features. And what this can be viewed as is providing a worst-case predictive loss minimization given all of this information up front. So given all of the pixels at the beginning of this prediction task. And like I said, the conditional random fields really are a success story in computer science. They've been applied to things like understanding meanings in text, objects in computer vision, and what's going on in people's daily activities from raw sensor data. So I think that's maybe something that as maximum entropy practitioners, we may want to take more credit for. But the problem is when we're looking at the sequential decision setting, that conditional entropy that we're maximizing isn't quite the right thing. So if we look a little bit deeper, the conditional entropy is based on the conditional probability. And here, each of the actions of the agent is conditioned on not just the current state that the agent's in, but all the future states that the agent hasn't even yet encountered. So if we built a model based on the conditional entropy, it would be kind of like giving the agent and ourselves this crystal ball that tells us about the future when we make predictions here. And in practice, that really doesn't coincide with reality. So again, we're going to instead use directed information theory. So just going back to our setting, we have the sequence of states and actions. And really this corresponds to the causally conditioned probability, where each of the actions is only conditioned on states, the current state or states that occurred previously. There's a natural entropy measure that's associated with this causally conditioned probability. And what we're going to do is maximize that causal entropy subject to some constraints on statistics of the sequence of actions and states that we observe. And again, we're going to assume that we know the dynamics of how the world works given our current state and action. And what this does is provides worst case predictive loss minimization given that the information, so the sequence of states, is going to be provided in sequence rather than all up front. So to make this concrete, we apply this to pedestrian trajectory prediction. And here we have some person moving through a space. And just as a simple example, we'll look at two statistics. So we'll look at the total distance that the person travels and the amount of that distance that's within 1 meter of some obstacle. So maybe right here is within 1 meter and so on. So if we were thinking about this from the optical controls perspective, we'd have some agent in some particular, or some person in a particular place in this environment. And that person could take a few different actions to move within the environment. And if we have stochastic dynamics, the next state that they'll be in will be according to this conditional probability here. And the way to think about this is that there's some value that some future expected value that the agent will receive if he enters in this state. So this is the value going forward using the same kind of decision process that I'm about to describe. But we can just back up these values. And in this case, the value of taking an action when you're in this state is just based on some instantaneous reward that's received, and then the expectation of these future states, the values of those future states. And then if you want to figure out the value of the current state, then it's just selected by considering which of these actions is the best for the agent. So you look at which one maximizes the action value for the agent, and that then becomes your state value. And you can iterate this recursively backwards using familiar dynamic programming techniques. The difference under maximum causal entropy, so a lot of things stay the same, but the key difference is this action selection criteria. So now we have an agent in a particular state. If that agent takes one action, he has this utility curve where these are basically the two different factors that we care about. So on one extreme, the agent only cares about minimizing the total distance that he travels, and on the other extreme, he cares about staying away from walls and obstacles. And depending on where on this kind of cross-section of the Lagrange parameters we look at, the agent's preferences lie, we end up with a different utility. Right? So this is the utility curve for one action. The utility curve for another action looks like this. And if we were just doing optimal control, we'd look at where these two curves cross. And if an agent's particular trade-offs were on one side of these curves, we prescribe to him this action. And if the agent's utility preferences were on the other side, we prescribe to him the other action. But under the maximum causal entropy approach, instead we look at this softmax of these two curves. This is kind of a smooth interpolation between the values of these two actions. And it looks like basically a recursively defined log partition function. And if we zoom in on a particular place in the space of preferences, we can measure the gap between the softmax and the underlying action value. And that tells us the probability of the person taking that action in that particular state given this model. And similarly, we can measure the other gap, and that gives us the complementary probability. So even though we started off by maximizing this causal entropy measure, we end up with this distribution that's very, very closely related to optimal control. The only difference is we use the softmax instead of the max for determining the value. And we end up with a stochastic policy rather than a deterministic policy. I won't say much about how we actually learn these parameters from data, except to say that convexity is very nice. And it turns out that under this model, the learning ends up being convex, or the optimization ends up being convex. So basically, convexity is preserved. And that helps us avoid things like local minimas that we could get stuck in up here otherwise. So we can just use standard convex optimization techniques. So going back to the example I was talking about, we gathered a lot of different trajectories in an environment. We looked at where those trajectories terminated. We looked at very simple features like the ones I described based on the obstacles and kind of blurred distances to obstacles. And we learned a cost function that helps explain the behavior that we see. And using this and combining it with Bayes' rule, since we don't know, given the trajectory, where exactly the goal of the agent is in this environment, we get nice predictive distributions of where the person is trying to reach and how they're going to get there. So I'll show a brief video of how this all comes together. The underlying motivation is we're trying to make it so that robots will navigate more intelligently in these spaces. And kind of the state of the art at this point is the robot walks up to you, and if you're in the way, it kind of waits for you to get out of the way, or maybe beeps a little bit. And we think using these sort of techniques, we can do a lot better by making these predictions about where people are moving. So these are predictions over time going forward, and the person's actually going to end up in this space right here. And this is actually a simulation of a robot using these predictions in this space. So we're going to have a human moving in the space and a robot, and this is the robot, and like I said, this is for artificial intelligence, so it only needs to be a little bit smart, but I'd argue that the robot's doing things that are somewhat intelligent, using these predictions to avoid the person moving in the space. I don't know, maybe you can agree or disagree whether this is artificial intelligence or not. Okay, so now I've talked about all this work about optimal control, where we're trying to maximize some expected reward, and then behavior prediction, where we're using the maximum causal entropy prediction, or maximum causal entropy prediction, and getting some softmax over expected reward. And now I'll tell you how these lead to the sequential investment setting. So it turns out that action prediction, where we just have a single state and a single action for a person, is equivalent to the gambling setting where we have uniform odds. So where the odds maker's belief about the outcome of events is uniform over the different actions. And once we look at the action sequence prediction setting, that ends up being equivalent to sequential gambling, where again we have uniform odds. And as has been explained earlier in this session, or the earlier session, this is because the KL divergence reduces to the entropy exactly when we have these uniform odds settings. So what we need to do is to generalize to the setting where these odds are not uniform. And to do that, we can introduce the principle of minimal relative causal entropy, where we're trying to minimize the KL divergence between our causally conditioned action distribution or event outcome distribution relative to the distribution that the odds maker is providing. Again, subject to some constraints about what we believe the outcome of these events will have to satisfy. And what this provides is worst case loss minimization that's relative to the odds that are being provided, given that we're receiving the information in sequence. So what this looks like from a dynamic programming perspective is, again, we have this setting where we have an agent and two different actions that the agent can employ. And this part doesn't change. The action value is just some instantaneous reward that the agent receives. That's based on the Lagrange multipliers. And then some expectation over the future reward. But now the state value is a bit different. It's, instead of being a softmax, it's a relative softmax, where it's relative to the odds maker's distribution. And what this means is that if the odds maker's beliefs lie within this set of constraints that we have, then our distribution will just exactly match the odds maker's distribution. So we'll bet exactly according to what the odds are provided and have no expected gain. But once we have constraints that separate the true outcome of distributions from the odds maker's implied beliefs, then the Lagrange multipliers that we end up learning are going to force us away from this kind of passive dynamics that are provided by the odds maker's beliefs. And what that means is that we're going to get these nice, robust guarantees in terms of the gains of our gambling allocations. So I guess I'll just conclude at this point and just summarize, I guess, that maximizing the expected growth seems like a very natural thing to do if we need to take into account risk. But also, if we want to take into account uncertainty, we need to use ideas from Jaynes and maximum entropy to do so in a more principled way than is being done in practice currently. And finally, there's a nice relationship in the sequential setting to optimal control and the relaxation of optimal control that my work helps detail. And of course, there's all these details in the actual paper. So with that, I'll thank you.
Questions? Yes.
I rather have a couple of comments to make because I was thinking a lot of the stuff you just presented to us. First, I would say that Kelly's method is not a method for winning. It's a method for not losing rapidly.
Sure.
So Shannon never used it and never made any money out of this. Neither did Kelly himself.
Kelly didn't, but Shannon is reported to have.
I am not sure he used it, this method, and it was because of he used this method. But that's, arguable. Anyway, I was wondering if there is any winning strategy in the stock market. I think everybody thought about it at one time or another. So I knew that John Nash also thought about it a lot. So I wrote him a letter asking, posed the question: does a winning strategy exist in the stock market? Non-constructive, because if you have constructive method, nobody will tell you, right? Because if you tell anybody, no matter how good your method is, if it's been used, it will disappear. It will not work. It will work only because of you use it. If everybody knows it, because not everybody cannot win stock market. It's a balanced thing.
Sure.
So
You have to sell the method. That is the problem.
Well,
And others lose and you win.
right. That's exactly right. So the answer from the reason I asked was, I knew that Nash had this game called Nash, and he came up with the non-constructive proof that whoever starts the game wins. But he doesn't know how to play exactly, but mathematically he proved that the strategy exists. So that's kind of question I posed to him. Does strategy exist non-constructive? His answer was very interesting. He said, without divine intervention, it's very difficult to win in the stock market game because there are others willing to prophesy as well. So, and it's exactly right. If you had, let's say, direct communication from God, who tells you the Microsoft stock will gonna go up, for example, you need to put everything up to the last penny. But the problem is that communication might have a noise. God doesn't lie to you, but it comes, with 10% of cases, it's just because of the noisy channel of communication with God, it goes wrong. So you cannot put everything. So the question is, if the 10% is the way, that's the percentage things can go wrong with the channel, the question is, what is the percentage of your money you have to put? And it turns out it's 80%. So
Okay.
And so the next research topic, filtering God, the signal filters.
So maybe I can just respond to that briefly. At least with this method, the real hard part is figuring out the constraints that govern the true outcomes of, for instance, the stock market and how they differ from the actual currently available prices that are being offered for the stocks. So all this is under the assumption that you can come up with some set of constraints that are different than what the odds maker, what the stock market is currently providing you to buy and sell at. And whether you can actually come up with those in practice is a subject way beyond what I'm going to touch. But yeah.
I have a question. So very nice work. I think that these kind of problems are very interesting for this kind of community, and I think that's where information theory and maximum entropy methods may actually make a real impact on the applications and on the technology. But I have a technical question. When you end up with a stochastic policy to make an action, okay? Obviously, you have to choose one action. So you might take the largest probability, but does that do anything to you? Or okay, I'll rephrase my question. Second part of the question is that can you reformulate the problem in such a way that you actually have to make just one action and not distribute your actions?
I see. So in this formulation, you don't have to take just one action, right? So if you get
but also in the optimal control one, you have a probability of taking action one or action two.
So in optimal control, if you're going to prescribe someone what to do, like you said, you'd probably just use the most probable sequence of actions.
It's not the same thing.
Or you could sample from the distribution.
So you should have a population of agents in the right proportions to the optimal control action. That's something I'm always confused about. What you get when you put that constraint in. Also the work of Todorov, you may Todorov, the papers I've read some of his papers. And at the end you end up with a mixture, with a policy which is a mixture. And so what do we do with that?
Yeah, I guess it depends what you're trying to do. So for us, we're just concerned with prediction. So we're fine having probabilities and not having to act according to them. Yeah, I haven't really thought about exactly what you do for the other case.
During your experiment with robot and person, did you predict offline, or you saw an online and real-time result of your prediction?
So that was one of the design considerations. So we wanted this to run at about 4 hertz for the prediction so that it could be used online. So while this was all in simulation, we actually did deploy it on a real robot and did some experiments in real time.
Any other questions? Okay, I have 2 questions. One on this slide. So if the second one is, so I'm a little confused, is the maximize expected amount of money you're going to get, so that's the highest, right? But it's 20% that you're going to get. Right? So that's your expected growth.
Right, yeah.
Right, okay.
Yeah,
So
if we're going to bet, sorry.
So I was confused about the fact that because it was 20% as opposed to 50%, let's say, you would go bankrupt. I can see how you would have to be able to handle larger fluctuations. So the lower that probability is, you'd have to handle much larger fluctuations. But if that's the case where you're maximizing your expected growth, and as long as you can handle those fluctuations, you should make the most using that.
So this was just for maximizing expected return, where you put all of your money on that particular horse.
Okay.
And in that case, with 20% probability, you're going to end up with nothing. And that's really I think the motivation for Kelly's work to maximize the growth rate instead, because you avoid that situation.
Okay, I guess I didn't need to read up on it. I thought that was including the odds, the payoff as well. But anyway, the next question I had was when you had the robot trying to avoid the human. So in Cairo, they like nobody has car insurance. So when they drive, they all try to avoid each other because they don't want to get hit. And so I was wondering if you ever took a bunch of robots, not any humans, but just robots trying to avoid each other, and to see if they could make their way around any place.
Yeah, that'd be interesting. We haven't done it yet. I know there are people who work on those sorts of things, and a lot of it then is in terms of coordination rather than just having these individualistic robots moving around.
Just a small clarification on the sort of exact utility function you're using with respect to returns. So this maximizing expected growth or maximizing the sort of log of your investment sort of already encodes a loss aversion. So doubling my money is as good as halving it is bad. Then later on you said, all right, so if we don't know the true distribution, we'll take an action that somehow is the min-max of the expected growth. If we've already encoded the loss aversion, shouldn't we then just average over expected log returns?
So in this case, I don't know what average means. So we don't have a full distribution over what the outcome could be within that region. So that's why we do this mini-max rather than an average.
Okay, so you can say it won't get any worse than this, but I don't know what will happen within that zone, so to speak.
Exactly.
Okay, let's thank the speaker. So that concludes the conference. I want to make a couple of statements. One, again, I wanted to make sure that if you didn't get your glass from last night, it's over here. and I also
You already had one, Ariel.
This is Marcel Reginatus.
and I also wanted to say what a pleasure and a privilege it was to work with the other fellow organizers. It was really, really great. And especially I want to mention our silent partner, Kevin Knuth, who couldn't be here, but also worked very hard in helping put together the conference. So we can get him on.